So we are very excited. We have Dr. Carroll Sheppard with us today, and Carroll is one of our lay leaders in the parish, and from time to time helps us out by preaching. Everybody loves to hear you preach, Carroll.
Thank you.
So what we wanted to do is I'm going to talk about A, B, C, D, E. Kind of got some questions for you, and so part of this kind of forum is to stimulate ideas and discussions, and for people to get to know members of the parish. And so I think many people have heard you preach, and over the years, you've been here many years, have gotten to know you, but not everybody knows you. But I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about the things that you're passionate about and that you value from St. Paul's, what being an Episcopalian means to you, and so on. But one of the first, with the A, if we start with A, so you're an anthropologist.
I am an anthropologist.
So tell us the story.
Gosh, a zillion years ago, back in the 1950s, there was a wonderful television show that came from the University Museum at the University of Pennsylvania called What in the World? And these interesting anthropologists and archaeologists would sit around an object on a table that had dry ice waves coming past it. And the voice off camera would say, "What in the world is that?" And I would listen to these wonderful people like Lauren Isley and Froelich Rainey and some of their guests and the other senior anthropologists as they literally worked through what on earth this fascinating thing was. And I said to my mother, "What is an anthropologist?" And she said, "Why don't you go to the library and get a book about it?" So I did, and I started reading and was captivated. And then I discovered that I could get books about all the different countries in the world, and then I discovered that you could study about them. And as luck would have it, we were doing geography in school that year, and I was just fascinated. So when it came time to go to college, I said I wanted to go to the University of Pennsylvania and major at the University Museum in anthropology. And that's how it happened.
So how does that, I think it's an excellent profession, and it's a kind of overlooked profession because people aren't quite sure what it is, but how would you apply some of the experience and knowledge that you acquired as an anthropologist looking at things like behavior in the church or how we're responding to, say, COVID-19? What is it about human nature that we need to pay attention to?
Right. Well, anthropology in its classic form is a branch of philosophy. And I realized rather quickly that it gave me an intellectual structure for nearly everything that I experienced. That when one looks with the anthropological eye at the world, one looks at the common human elements and human experience. So when I, for example, was a consultant working with congregations in the diocese, I would walk in and mentally treat each one like its own little tribe. And every congregation has its own ways, its own habits, its own prayers, its own way of doing things. And as you get to know the congregation, you get to know about those life ways, those bits of culture, the things that, as Pierre Bourdieu, a French sociologist, said, the things that go without saying, what you don't have to ask because you already know. And that's what makes you part of a larger group. I'm sure that you have had this experience as you come into different congregations in St. Paul's. And there's that steep learning curve at the very beginning where you have to get to know how we do things. And at St. Paul's, we sometimes do things in some very quirky ways that make us us.
So tell me a little bit about what you're looking through those spectacles around COVID. Everybody's concerned about this right now. What is it that we need to do as a human species to handle this thing?
Well, you've all heard mask, gloves, hand sanitizer, distance. But I think more than that, what we need as a species is to remember that we are an extraordinarily resilient species. Human beings are amazingly adaptable. We figured out how to live from the high Arctic down to Antarctica. We have learned how to live at 18,000 feet or below sea level in so many different climates and situations, and we figure things out. So we're in the process of figuring out how to live with COVID-19. And as long as we remember that nobody's ever done this before, as nearly as anybody can remember, we can read about pandemics in the past, but we can't relive those pandemics. We have our own. Then I think that we remember we have a resilience built into our DNA. And I think Jesus knew that. Jesus was constantly talking about how people respond to situations. In the gospel this morning, he was telling us that a woman puts yeast into flour, a fisherman goes out to fish. He was talking about a series of cultural acts in response to the true environment. And I'm sure that if Jesus were here now during COVID-19, he would be reminding us that this is part of the natural world and that we are resilient people. And of course, blessedly, you and I are people of faith.
That's really wonderful. So I'm going to move to B now. So from anthropology, B for book. So you recently wrote a really interesting book, and you shared it at a forum, and the book is called Congregational Connections. Can you tell us a little bit about what prompted that and what it, what nuggets of wisdom could St. Paul's get right now as from that book in terms of going into a search and looking for a rector?
Right. The book has its origin right here at St. Paul's. Our assistant at the time, Nancy Delaplane, who's now the rector of Trinity Church, Buckingham, in Bucks County, and I sat down one day over lunch and said, who are these Gen Xers? Now, mind you, this was back in 2003, 2004, about. And we said, these are young folks who are coming to St. Paul's, and they're not quite the same as the boomers, the silents, the greatest generation that have gone before them. So we put together a clergy learning group with help from the diocese, and we spent that year and then the year after 2000, maybe that was then 2006, 2007, talking with other clergy about not only Gen Xers, but the next group of people who were coming after them, the millennials, and talking about how they experienced their world, what their favorite technologies were. The book came out in 2011, so that's quite a while ago. And in the meantime, we've added a 7th generational cohort. I think that that cohort started just about when President Trump was elected, but certainly with the great wisdom of hindsight, people will look back and go, oh no, that's the pandemic cohort. I've even heard them called Gen P or Gen C, Gen COVID or Gen Pandemic. And they will experience the world in extraordinarily different ways than you and I did when we were growing up. And they will form a group of people who have a shared experience, as they will with some of their slightly older Gen Z or wired generation, wireless, I've been told, wireless generation, the way the world works. What it means for St. Paul's is we're going to have to get to know each other again. We're going to have to get to know each other in new ways, which we're busy doing. We resilient people of faith have discovered Zoom and how to be together electronically, and now how to be together in these small, unusual worship pods. I can't even quite call them congregations, but they're the 25 people allowed in the pod at this time. A worship bubble, how's that? We're even inventing new language. And it will be the first time in the world's history, as far as we know, that 7 generational cohorts will be alive at the same time. That incredibly changes our world, because we instinctively make room for each other. So until COVID, one generation had its own clubs, another generation had its own bars, another generation had its own theaters, another generation had its own neighborhood and community mores. Ironically, COVID-19 is reuniting the generations through Zoom, and also because if you are living in or close to older or younger members of your own family, you are very likely interacting with them much, much more than you did when you were free to go out to your favorite dive some evening, or out to the favorite restaurant, or go to the opera.
So what impact does that have, say, on the search? If you were going to give some advice to the search committee based on this knowledge of being aware of this is the new world in which the church needs to kind of rethink its mission and to welcome different people, because in seminary it was 3 generations. It was grandparents, parents, and children.
Right.
That's how we looked at it. But you're saying we can't think that way anymore.
We can't think that way. Not if we're smart, not if we're resilient, not if we're looking at the world which God has actually given us right now. Well, I would certainly include video clips. I would have the confirmation class doing something important and let our candidates see who this rising generation might be. And they are, for the most part, excuse me, I brought my crib sheet of the 7 generational cohorts. They are our Gen Z, or wireless generation, and their entire world is electronic. They and the slightly older groups, the millennials, are what they call digital natives. I am not a digital native. My favorite means of communication is still the telephone, though I'm coming around to Zoom.
Great.
Yeah. And the other thing that I would suggest for the search process is that we think very seriously about asking members of each cohort to say what it is that they particularly are looking for in a new rector. And we be very transparent about the fact that St. Paul's, unlike many churches, is blessed with all 7 generations.
Great, that's really good.
Yeah.
So I want to move to C, and C stands for Carl. And Carl is very lucky because he's your husband. So can you tell us...
I'm very lucky because Carl is my husband.
So tell us about your family and what you're doing, what else you do when you're not at St. Paul's.
Well, at this time of year, Captain Carroll Sheppard is running his charter boat out of Beach Haven. And this is his lifelong dream. He used to just be a weekend captain when he was working, but now that he's fully retired for the 5th time, this one seems to be sticking, and so he is happily running his charter boat. But in the past, he's been vice president or chief human resource officer for a number of healthcare organizations in the Delaware Valley. And he still, from time to time, gets phone calls from his old consulting clients about various issues of compensation and executive remuneration in the broadest sense. So that's fun. I have a couple of brothers, one in New York State and one in New Hampshire. We get to see each other as often as we can, but not since March, which is not easy. But we were lucky enough to have Carl's sister from Roanoke come up on the train, and I collect her at 30th Street Station, and she just stayed with us for the past month in Beach Haven and was delighted to be back. We have lots of nieces and nephews, and no great nieces and nephews yet, which is a relief because I don't think I can handle. Oh, we do. Actually, they are great. We already have greats. We don't have great-greats. I get confused about generations. Isn't that ironic?
Yes, that's great. So D, disruption. Now you found this interesting article.
Mm-hmm.
We put it in Happenings. I think it deals with the disruption of COVID, the disruption of a search, all that stuff. What's jumped out for you when you saw that piece?
I was fascinated by it. It's put out by the Alban Institute, which now has moved to Duke Divinity School. And it is by a woman who describes how her fantastic business, which she built, basically got too big and too successful. She was running around like a chicken with her head cut off and trying to figure out how to micromanage what had in fact become 3 separate operations. And one day, she and her staff sat down and faced reality, that it needed to break into 3 separate organizations. And so she wrote about that experience and about the need, and here's what really stood out for me, about the need to pivot. When things have got to a stage where they no longer work, face up to it, experience the grief of letting something that you have built, something very precious, go. Because as I have often said to congregations that I was consulting with, if you're holding on tight, God can't put something new into your hands. You have to let go of what you have. You have to stop gripping and start opening. But that's a very sad process, because you may have to let go of things that you care about deeply in order to have something new put in your hands. And so her word for this is you have to pivot. You have to stop standing 4 square on your own 2 feet and very possibly go on to the toe of 1 foot and turn to face the new reality. That's not easy. And so her article is, for me, about that process of pivoting.
Mm-hmm. How might that apply here at St. Paul's?
Oh, we're in the middle of it. We're right in the middle of it. You are the interim rector. And so you're our first clear sense of what the pivot looks like. And then Dan came to join you as our interim assistant. And that's the next piece of what the interim process and the pivot looks like. And then we got COVID. And that's the next bit of the pivot. So from my perspective, as an almost 50-year member of St. Paul's, we are facing in some very different direction than we were a year and a half ago, when Cliff first told us that he was going to retire.
And there's a lot of anxiety, obviously. I mean, what you're describing, automatically your blood pressure goes up, and so how do you walk through that? What's your kind of counsel for people who are feeling pretty anxious, whether it's COVID or the search or finding the right person or whatever? What's your advice to them?
I would say that it's Jesus' very good advice, to be people of this world but not owned by this world, to keep our eyes on Jesus, on God, to feel strongly that the Holy Spirit is leading us to some new place. Jesus didn't say, "I'm with you always" for nothing. He meant, I am with you always. And if you are not seeing me around anymore, be of good cheer. I have sent the Holy Spirit to be with you. So we are in movement. We are in transition. We're like that. Do you know the wonderful story of the Hans Christian Andersen story, The Ugly Duckling?
No, I don't know that.
Well, Hans Christian Andersen told a fairy tale about a little duckling, and the little duckling never seemed to fit. The little duckling didn't get what other ducklings were doing, and it was the ugliest duckling on the face of the earth, and it felt so bad. It just wasn't having things happen right. And all the ducks flew off, and he was left all by himself to get through the Danish winter. And he found a little pond where there was still some water, and he swam around, and finally it got to be spring. And one day on his pond, he saw the most beautiful, beautiful things he'd ever seen in his life. Long, graceful white necks, high, proud heads, beautiful, strong wings. And he thought, well, if I'm going to die, I might as well go and look at something beautiful before I go. So he swam out beyond the riverbank, and he peeped around the reeds, and he saw these beautiful beings right in front of him, and he thought, well, I guess they'll just kill me because I'm so ugly. And the swans looked at him and said, where did a swan come from? He said, I'm a swan. Yes, they said, and a very beautiful young swan you are. We're in that process. We're in the ugly duckling phase. COVID is our Danish winter.
Wow. So the other, we prayed this morning for the dual pandemic of racism and COVID. So how does that pivoting apply to some of the major political, racial, and cultural upheaval that we're going through right now?
You're asking me something out of my knowledge area completely. I'm as baffled by all of this as everyone is. I think our black and brown friends are asking themselves the same questions that our white and other skin-hued friends are. Who are we? Who are we? How do I understand our society? What's going on? Should I be acting differently? What in this very messy time is happening? And of course, being right in the middle of it, we can't see it.
But it's that pivot idea.
But it is that it's
helpful.
that pivot.
We're
there.
And changing history, reevaluating our history, hearing justice, and that Hebrew word for when Solomon wanted discernment, the translation is to hear justice. So
Yes.
how are we hearing justice at St. Paul's, do you think?
The image that comes instantly to my mind is our 9 o'clock worship service, as it was before. Gathered around the freestanding altar, gathered around the labyrinth, with the little ones crawling around the labyrinth and pulling themselves up on the altar, and the slightly older ones looking at each other and seeing everybody around the circle. And we had a wonderful mix of different skin tones, different ages, different backgrounds, but we were all together in a circle around the altar. And Van Williams took some wonderful pictures from the choir loft of that gathered circle.
That's hearing justice.
That for me is seeing and hearing justice.
Yeah, that's great. That's really good. So my last question is E, Episcopalian.
Episcopalian.
What is it you love about being an Episcopalian?
Oh gosh, so much. I love the fact that we keep our knees loose. Most Episcopalians, I think, except perhaps for those who are really Anglo-Catholics, like the variety of our services, like the fact that our hymns and music come from a wide variety of places, that our worship forms can vary depending upon which church I had the pleasure of hearing a bishop from the Church of Wales preach, and he shared prayers in Welsh. I've heard Manny, our former assistant, talk about the Church of Ghana and what Sunday is like in a church in Ghana, and so many other experiences. That's a richness that's worldwide. And I sometimes, when I hear our liturgy, picture in my mind the same or a similar liturgy being said all around the world by so many in the Anglican Communion. That's a source of great joy to me. And then I love the variety of services at St. Paul's. And I love being able to listen to the National Cathedral online services and their music. I love the fact that our National Cathedral is a house of prayer for everyone, and that we can have state funerals, funerals that unite the nation there. And I think, going back to Queen Elizabeth and the Elizabethan Compact, where she looked at the Protestants, members of the church, and she looked at the Catholic members of the church, and she said, I don't care what you believe, you will sit down peaceably and eat the Lord's Supper together. And I think that's splendid.
Carroll, thank you so much for your time, your ministry, your insights, and we're looking forward to hearing many, many more of them in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.